think that was a right. She was leaving.
No, you can keep talking. I just started recording this because we're like ranting. Guys, I wrote a whole like intro to the show, but like an hour before we started recording, ICE stormtroopers just straight up murdered a woman in the streets of Minneapolis. And everyone's just kind of shook. And now my show notes seem completely trite. You know, we want to talk about Venezuela, Greenland. And I think this is a great opportunity, a tragic opportunity to explain like why, you know, there's no distance really between the impunity of US foreign policy and domestic policy. Like, you don't think that this extrajudicial extraordinary rendition of Nicolas Maduro like affects how ICE agents conduct themselves on the ground? As a former member of the US Special Operations Community, the more impunity that I know that I can get away with, or that, you know, that my command will allow me to get away with, that's like where I'm going to, it might influence my decisions. You know, personally, I wasn't really about that, but there are some sociopaths in that community, obviously, who, you know, were empowered by leadership decisions. And so like, this is one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about like how the charge of like war crimes and genocide is actually sticks to individuals. You know, it's why Netanyahu has an ICC arrest warrant, and they have an ongoing genocide case against them in the International Court of Justice. It's not because, you know, there's a really easy to prove template for like genocide. It's because the message that comes down from command, like Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, that's like, you know, we can do whatever we want, and, you know, we need to exterminate this entire people. It comes from the top. And that's one of the big litmus tests for like, if a genocide is being committed, it's like the messaging coming out of the leadership, because it's hard to prove the intention of it. But when you say it out loud, you know, it kind of gives more, imparts more impunity and more cover for, you know, these ground sloggers, it be they IDF soldiers in Gaza or ICE agents in Minneapolis, to get away with doing whatever they want because they think the leadership, they won't be prosecuted and they think they're going to be protected. So when you know, capture Maduro with no legal basis, what does this do to the people on the ground who are supported and given cover by the administration? So I think the days of not caring about foreign policy, if you're worried about like national security and authoritarianism at home, probably, you know, stop pretending like it doesn't impact you.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is something that we've been saying, I think, repeatedly now on the show. When we're speaking about the desperation of the United States and the international level, the way in which we're seeing the arbitrary use of the military force, and an entire genocide that has been conducted, and the way in which the political establishment has, you know, carried itself, the suppression of free speech, the way that they have been basically shutting down independent media, arresting students, and then obviously the implementation. Not by the implementation, but like sort of the way that that ICE, the rights that ICE has already been given up until this point, it's all part of the same sort of, you know, I guess, collapsing empire, I guess, reaction to things. The way that the US is desperate abroad, it's also desperate internally within its own home base to suppress dissidents, to suppress reactions, because the reality of the situation is that things are going to get a lot worse, not just globally, but also for the American citizens, also for the American working class. We're going to start seeing more aggressive tactics being used, not just against protesters and migrants, but or even more at the institutional level. We're seeing an erosion of these institutions and these liberal rights and ideologies that have been sort of like that have been, I guess, sustaining rather the illusion of freedom and democracy in the United States. But that era is now gone. And I think, and I'm sorry because I'm a bit like lost for words, because I just saw, like, I mean, I think you just showed me, I had no idea this happened until like right before we going on, and I'm just shocked as to what actually occurred. We're going to start seeing things like this occur in the United States rather aggressively, because, as I've said before, the real face of capitalism and the ruling class at the end of the day is fascist. It's fascist in nature. It's about the minority ruling the majority. And if you so much as push back, in any way, shape, or form, they're going to start cracking down. And their desperation is showing in the internal in the internal dynamics of the United States as well as externally. And so, yeah, what's happening abroad is going to be boomerangs that come straight back home. Surveillance, mass oppression, and the slaughtering and killing of civilians with ease. And it's horrendous, honestly, what we just saw. Obviously, I know we can't show the whole video. I'm sure people will see it, but
yeah,
I mean, this was an execution in cold blood.
Let's just back up and contextualize it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, first of all, ICE entered Minneapolis. Minneapolis is a hotbed of immigration. There's been a bunch of controversy, about that state, about Somalis, about all these minority groups, large Muslim population. ICE goes in there full bore. And, there's a lot of, community resistance. There has been for a long time, especially in these like more blue states and sanctuary cities. ICE officers don't like going in there. They're roundly like made fun of, shamed, yelled at. Sometimes there's, physical resistance, and they're like on edge. And they're also like half of them, a lot of them are like straight up Proud Boys. Most of them are white supremacists, even if they're not white. And they were just go in full tactical gear with the complete backing of the administration. I'm surprised this hasn't happened sooner. But basically what happened is this woman in Minneapolis, this happened this morning, was kind of blocking the road as a legal observer. And so we're going to show some of the footage. We're not going to show the actual shooting because I don't want to get this channel banned forever. Like, this is being massively suppressed on TikTok, Instagram, and social media. And here we go. So the ICE officers, about like an entire squad of them, get out to deal with this one woman who is obstructing a roadway. That is a Class C misdemeanor charge. I have one from a protest action. I was booked and immediately released. That's it. But apparently it's now a death sentence. So we're walking up, we get out of these unmarked pickup trucks in full tactical gear. The woman starts to drive away. And I'm cutting out the part where the guy unloads 5 rounds directly into the driver's seat. We're going to skip ahead and get civilian reactions because there wasn't a crowd. Elina, if you look at the video, there's not a big protest crowd. Like, these guys are under zero threat. There is no reason that they should be, this.
It's just a few women.
And it's women.
Just a few women out there.
It's a woman driving and it's a woman recording, reacting to just watching a field execution.
What the fuck? What the fuck? You just fucking, what the fuck did you do?
Yeah. So I want to, and then I wrote and I commented on social media because right before this happened, I was reading and responding to a New York Times article. Okay, and this is how crazy the timing is on this. The New York Times just published this article. Maduro is gone, but repression in Venezuela has intensified. Security forces have boarded buses, searched phones, and interrogated people, looking for evidence that they welcomed the capture of Nicolas Maduro. My comment was simply, so Venezuelan security forces are doing ICE-style enforcement just with less visible murder in the streets. From military crackdowns on political dissent to child marriage laws, everything we accuse global South countries of doing to gin up consent for war has already been perfected here. A disciplined stance of non-interference is the only sane position for U.S. citizens. I mean, honestly, that's kind of like a milquetoast take on what I think U.S. citizens should be doing. But we're just leaving it at that. Like, that's like the baseline position, because what are we doing right now? We're also publishing articles in our legacy media about protests in Iran. Trump just said 2 days ago, if Iran keeps killing protesters, we're going to have to intervene. We're murdering protesters too. And we also allow child marriage. Like, what? So it's just the contradictions are contradicting.
Oh, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? This is not new. This is not a new information. This is something that has been a standard U.S. policy for the longest amount of time, or just Western policy more broadly. And that is, to apply these sort of contradictory and hypocritical standards to other nations. But they don't. These are not standards that they necessarily follow at home. It's just more so pretext in order to justify intervention. It's nothing more than, manufacturing consent of sorts and sort of building on this narrative in attempt to villainize adversaries that don't adhere to their world order. I mean, it's something that we've also said before on this channel, and what we've discussed extensively, and that is, I mean, the United States has actually had a history of supporting, actual dictators, from Chile to Spain. I mean, even going so far back as Franco in Spain, or this is not anything new for the United States. The idea is to preserve international actors, as well as obviously at home, that will always preserve the interests of capital, and that will always be at the expense of the masses, and they will take whatever action is necessary to suppress people internally and externally. And so this is the hypocrisy of now claiming that they're in any way, shape, or form interested in the protests in Iran, when under the Shah there was brutality taking place under the Shah in Iran, which is what led to the Iranian Revolution, which a lot of people don't know, but the Iranian Revolution had actually started off as a left-wing movement, but due to internal fracturing, then it became sort of hijacked by the theocracy, etc. But it did start off as a bona fide left-wing sort of resistance against the Western and US, UK backed Shah in Iran that was brutal. So now to sort of take some sort of direct concern as to the well-being of Iranians, when first of all, the Iranian Revolution was the direct consequence of oppression that was brought about by the United States. But more importantly, when you look at what's happened in the United States itself, it's just classic hypocrisy and this sort of mass gaslighting of these imperial bourgeois powers, and in the way, in their attempt to justify imperialism. But it's becoming so blatant and so desperate at this particular point in time that it's very difficult to sell these narratives now. It's very difficult to try to tell the public we care about Iranian protesters, whilst ICE agents are raiding the streets, kidnapping people in broad daylight, and now even killing a unarmed civilian American citizen, woman no less, in broad daylight. I mean, that was like a cold field execution almost. I mean, he just jumped right in front of her and just shot her 5 times. I think that's insanity. I mean, honestly, it was without wanting to say anything more, but I don't want to get too descriptive, but it was barbaric. And yeah, it's gonna get way worse.
So we all saw the footage. The Department of Homeland Security just released its statement on social media. This was from 48 minutes before time of recording. We saw the videos. We can't be gaslit. Today, ICE officers in Minneapolis were conducting targeted operations when rioters, there were no rioters, began blocking ICE officers, and one of these violent rioters weaponized her vehicle, attempting to run over our law enforcement officers in an attempt to kill them, an act of domestic terrorism. An ICE officer, fearing for his life, the lives of his fellow law enforcement, and the safety of the public, fired defensive shots. He used his training and saved his own life and that of his fellow officers. The alleged perpetrator was hit and is deceased. The ICE officers who were hurt are expected to make full recoveries. That is insane.
I mean, the level of gaslighting and the way they're undermining the intelligence of the public, I find absolutely infuriating. I mean, he jumped in front of the car specifically. She wanted to leave.
We're watching it right now on Twitter. I don't care if this video gets taken down. We don't, it's like, whatever at this point. I'm so pissed. So these are the ICE officers fearing for their lives. Okay. And that's how it happened. Also, I wanted to make this connection. You said like, we're not even pretending anymore. I think the theme or the title of this episode is going to have something to do with Star Wars, because like we are like comically the Galactic Empire at this point. The Department of Homeland Security yesterday just posted, "Good morning, Minneapolis." So this is a classic soundbite from the Vietnam War, where like bands would come to like, radio, play on Radio Saigon and be like, good, and like to entertain the troops, be like, "Good morning, Vietnam," because they're seeing this as like a counterinsurgency operation, and they're celebrating the Vietnam War. And of course, George Lucas, when he was coming up with the concept of Star Wars, was like, yeah, The Vietnamese are the Rebel Alliance, and the Galactic Empire is the U.S. military. And I think this is a perfect corollary. I cannot believe they posted "Good Morning Minneapolis" based off a classic, iconic Radio Saigon thing. Like, what? That's insanity.
I mean, to be honest with you, Greg, nothing surprises me anymore. I think, when the new year started on the 1st of January this year, I just said to everyone, Happy New Year, everybody. Things are about to get a lot worse. And it came across as cruel, but obviously I think this is, we all knew it was coming. Right. Yeah, I knew we were going to be right, but it's just, I think people need to mentally, and in other ways, start preparing for what is to come. Things will get a lot worse in the United States and globally, for that matter, because this is what happens when an empire is collapsing, when they're losing control over all their, I guess, all their. When they're losing control over the world, essentially, which up until this point they've been able to exploit in order to sustain themselves, and they're also losing control over their own citizens, who are beginning to make valid questions, and not just at the Epstein files, but looking at the genocide, looking at how the United States has conducted itself. Even the MAGA movement in the United States is kind of, falling apart at this particular point, because there were so many people that had actually voted for Trump who really genuinely believed in his anti-establishment rhetoric, and that he was really going to be anti-war, anti-nation building, and making America great again for the American working class. All these tropes that he was using specifically in order to appeal to this particular voter base, and how he is so emphatically actually disappointed his MAGA supporters, and how that's causing a rift between even the so-called center right or right wing or more conservative rather voter base in the United States. So this is causing a massive amount of dissent within the U.S. And as conditions will become progressively worse, because it will become progressively worse, and we'll get into that obviously in a little bit, as we're looking more towards multiple polarity as well, but also how the U.S. is sort of overstretching itself, and how its own economy is on the verge of collapsing. What that means for the American public, as the political establishment and the ruling class behind it are going to try to suppress the dissidence that's going to start arising out of it within the United States itself. It's going to get very, very severe. And so, I mean, this is honestly, it sounds terrible to say, but this is just a first taste.
Oh yeah. And actually,
that sounds horrible to say.
They're really frustrated. When the administration is really frustrated that this happened, because this is kind of like a wrench in the gears from a PR perspective. Like, they are like, going back to some of the show notes that hopefully, that I spent 2 hours writing before the episode, that just got kind of blown out of the water. Like, while this is all happening, and while this story is breaking about this field execution of a U.S. citizen, in the meantime, the neocon warhawks and Beltway NatSec psychos in D.C. are high on their own supply, talking about how successfully this suspect Delta raid was against Venezuelan President Maduro in Caracas. Now they feel empowered to do whatever they want to do in the Western Hemisphere, which includes Greenland. The glaciers are melting, y'all, and we got to go full spectrum dominance on those emerging Arctic sea passages. At any rate, here's John Bolton's spiritual successor, Senator Rick Scott, speaking to the press this morning.
What the president did, and Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth and everybody, our military, Maria Corina Machado, and what they did in Venezuela is going to change Latin America. This is the start of changing Venezuela. Then we're going to fix Cuba. Nicaragua will get fixed. Next year, we'll get a new president in Colombia. We're going to start, the democracy is coming back to this hemisphere.
So the president...
Oh, God.
Yeah, so we're going to fix the lips. We're going to fix the nose and the forehead wrinkles until all of the Americas are shaped into one monstrous Mar-a-Lago faced monstrosity of capitalist extraction and exploitation and cops. For there is but one God, the jealous God of Israel, money. But he's not for you, and certainly not for 99% of Venezuelans or anybody else on this continent. So I guess we're 20 minutes in, but here's the plug. Welcome to Colonial Outcast, the anti-imperialist podcast that strives to present a solution-based geopolitical analysis to those of us living in the end times and desire a better, more sane world. A wearisome task, but your support means everything. So thanks. We're on Patreon. Link in the description. Now, this really was supposed to be our follow-up episode to the last Venezuela episode we released this past Saturday. There's been a torrent of information, really, and analysis released since then, and a reinvigorated push for like heedless domination coming out of the White House. To discuss this, I'm so glad you came on. So much has happened today. All right. First of all, we've got a renewed push for special operations propaganda, which you and I talked about yesterday about doing. It's important we do that because guess what? SWAT teams were created in America based off special operations propaganda to fight the Black Panthers, and again, we're getting a lot of Vietnam vibes. So we're right back where we started. So we need to talk about that. The seizure of a Russia flagged oil tanker off the coast of Iceland, maybe, if we have time, what this all means for the future of geopolitics and the working class. So I guess it's fun times in the most sarcastic way possible. Too bad we only have an hour to discuss like the most salient points about what's going on here. But like, it's just got to be freeform at this point. Like, it's just what's happening today is too insane. So I guess really because special operations propaganda is so intertwined with like the police state here in America that I guess we should just start there, because like the raid in Caracas, which is ushering in this new age of like gunboat diplomacy, not because we want to put boots on the ground to bully Latin American countries into giving us diplomatic concessions. It basically allows us to project capabilities that could, target their leadership. The myth of the decapitation strike, which is a myth, it doesn't really work, is kind of as the stick, which will beat everybody into compliance. And again, it doesn't really signal actual military strength, but we'll get into that. It's a source of propaganda. So I did find this really funny video by this guy I follow. I'll link his account in the description. This is basically how a lot of the base who looks at it, that's susceptible to military propaganda, looks at what happened in Caracas 4 days ago.
Nah, see, what you don't understand is the military might. The military might of the military. I mean, literally just go down there with like 4.477s, 7.774 Apaches, and they created a perimeter, right? To extract Maduro. They created a perimeter. 37 F-47. China doesn't have this, dude. China, Russia, they're inadequate, they're inferior. I love the military so much because it's violent. It's powerful. It's powerful. And I'm just one guy, knowing that a military represents my interests, that it's for me, it hypes me up. Makes me proud. It makes me proud. I mean, military might. I might get a boner from the military if I talk about it any longer. I mean, the logistical complexity of going to a country and just grabbing a dude is so hard to do. Can you even imagine doing that? Can you even imagine going into a country and forcing your way in and grabbing one guy? Can you imagine that shit? It would be next to impossible. It'd be like an endgame Thanos time travel Infinity Stone collection scenario to do that. I'm just so glad that the US has military might. Oh!
Your microphone, man.
Literally, though, it's that. For a lot of people, for a lot of voters here in America, I grew up in Texas. It's one of the most militarized states on the planet. Most of the military recruitment comes out of this state. Like that's the depth of analysis for most people.
Well, I mean, that's very unfortunate. I mean, obviously, I can't comment. Okay. I don't live in the U.S., but yeah.
So they're just like, hell yeah, brother. That's freedom for you. And like, these are the same people that misinterpret the lyrics of Fortunate Son by CCR, which is an anti-draft dodger song. All the rich kids, the senator's sons didn't have to go to fight in Vietnam. Neither did Donald Trump, Dick Cheney, George Bush. Bone spurs, y'all. Bone spurs. But they'll send you to fight and die. So, it's definitely difficult to reach people. But I wanted to talk about like a larger trend with how the U.S. kind of portrays or projects a military strength and capacity that it doesn't have. It started with World War II. So, and we've talked about this before. At the end of World War II, most of the world recognized that the major factor in the defeat of the Axis powers, specifically Nazi Germany, was the Red Army. It was. And over the course of the Cold War, it's kind of shifted to America being the one that really decisively defeated the Nazis. Well, I mean, it was the beginning of the end when the German North Africa Corps surrendered. That's true. But this idea of logistics and specialization and complexity, that's kind of embodied now by like special operations in the community that I grew up in, was kind of like field tested with D-Day propaganda, like the Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. It was a really complex, insane operation. And they kind of just used that to project like no one else could do it. Yeah. I mean, the Russian army, even before the war started, the Red Army had like 3/4 of its officer corps purged. They were not capable of like complex operations in that way. The U.S. was like the only power at the time that had the logistical infrastructure to do that, stuff like that. And all went into this idea of like overwhelming military capacity that just isn't borne out by history. Flash forward to Vietnam. It was a war that we were losing. A lot of the propaganda was it was about the birth of the special operations community. Before Vietnam, the only special operations unit we had was Rangers. All right. So, folks, I don't remember what I said, but it set this precedent for U.S. military propaganda and force projection through, these ideas that we have overwhelming capabilities. And yeah, it just really wasn't borne out. And the birth of the special operations community came during the Vietnam War. The only kind of commando unit that we had was the Rangers before then. And the Vietnam War, because of the counterinsurgency requirements, created a need for small groups of irregular warfare fighters, as Pete Hegseth would say, as Whiskey Pete would say. So you saw the birth of SEAL teams, Delta Force, Green Berets, everything like that. And they were used as propaganda because they were better than like most soldiers on the planet. They're a very small group of people that killed a disproportionate number, had a disproportionate casualty ratio, against the Viet Cong. That doesn't win wars. It didn't work in Vietnam and it didn't work now. And, it was also contemporaneous with the rise of, this idea that there was this race-based counterinsurgency war that was going to happen in the United States. So they took the paradigm of these special operations units and built SWAT teams to fight the Black Panthers and stuff like that. So it's always been connected, but this like special operations propaganda that we're seeing in Venezuela is not actually a position of strength. Now we did look at, the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, these NatSec psychos talking about the raid itself. And I just wanted to play a video about it, just so you guys could get a sense of what these people actually think about this kind of stuff. I think it's going to be instrumental.
In the middle of the night, it was dark. Well, it was dark because it was night, but apparently it was also dark because it seems Cybercom turned off all the lights. This is the way that modern wars are fought, especially if you're the United States and we operate very well in darkness. Because of that really fabulous intelligence picture, we didn't need to see where we were going. We had all the technology we needed and we had it all mapped out. So it really helps us to have Caracas, or at least parts of Caracas, be literally dark. There also may have been some internet outages. That's really important. As you may remember with the bin Laden raid, one of the very first indications that got out that a raid was on an operation. So it's a very smart thing that they did as well. This kind of operation where you layer so many things at the same time, it's truly joint operations. My colleague Mark will talk more about this, but you had Spacecom involved, you had Cybercom involved, you had intelligence involved, and then you had all the military forces involved too. A joint operation like that is really quite difficult to do. And from the Cybercom perspective, setting that operation up would have taken quite a long time and an incredible skill level in order to make all those pieces come together at the right moment.
Okay, so 2 points about this before I hand it over to you. Like we talked about, like, yeah, of course, great. No other military in the world has those capabilities, which is true. It's true. However, that's all we can do. Like, that doesn't win wars. Having a vision for victory wins wars. Boots on the ground, limitless artillery and munition supplies and air superiority. Like, we don't have all those requirements. We can't fight China or Russia or Iran, but we can do these specialized operations. So this feeds into, a re-envisioning or a new era of gunboat diplomacy. So just to define terms before Elina talks about what that looks like practically when it comes to like Colombia, Cuba, Nicaragua, Greenland, it's kind of a 19th, well, it's not kind of, sorry. It's a 19th century concept that works by using the visible threat of or limited use of power. So special operations are limited use of power, naval power, to intimidate a weaker nation into complying with demands, achieving foreign policy goals without full-scale war, often involving warships appearing off the coast to coerce political or economic concessions. And this was seen kind of like with Commodore Perry in Japan, or U.S. actions and acquisitions in Latin America in the 19th and early 20th century. So it's a display of overwhelming force to compel action from a less powerful state, leveraging military presence for diplomatic leverage. So basically, when it says like we're going to get when Senator Rick Scott says we're going to have a new president in Colombia next year, that's gunboat diplomacy. When you have that many naval assets posted off the coast, saying, "Hey, government, get a new guy in there that we can work with better, or else, we're going to pull a Maduro on you." So this isn't something new. Again, gunboat diplomacy has always been inherently might makes right, extractive, and has the great advantage of not having to engage in the domestically unpopular boots on the ground predicament. And you still get the oil. However, my question, and I want your opinion on this, how is this different from 19th century gunboat diplomacy?
Oh, I mean, that's a very open question, and there's so many things to say.
I know.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll preempt it by saying, first of all, we weren't like one of the major colonial powers in the 19th century. We did have our own colonies, but that's changed. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
It's not just that. I would say, I mean, listen, even if we look at the history of Venezuela and going back to, I guess, Trump constantly regurgitating the same point that they took our land and they took our oil and they took this and they took that, essentially, essentially explaining what the United States problem is with Venezuela, and that is the nationalization process, or the partial renationalization that took place under Chavez in the 2000s. And when you go back historically and obviously look at how that even came to be in the first place, like when the United States is talking about how they took away their rights, etc. I mean, the United States, although it wasn't the only the only power at the particular time, obviously with all these European powers as well, the European powers alongside the United States are the ones that had actually put a dictator in power in the 1920s, up between, I think, the early 1910s up until 1935, Juan Rodriguez, Gonzalez, who had actually been sort of backed by the United States through an illegal coup and through military power that had actually then gave him the ability to be able to give those rights away to colonial power. So even though the United States wasn't necessarily a power, the reason I bring that up is that it still was rather dominant, at least in the Latin American region, from even rather early on. So that's actually how those rights came to belong to European and American oil companies to begin with. They were taken by force by the establishing control over Venezuela indirectly through a brutal dictator who then gave over those rights and was then himself profiting off of those off of these American oil companies by working with them, but the Venezuelan people were not really seeing any of that, and that was pretty much been the history of Venezuela under sort of U.S. and European powers in their country. It's sort of the same thing that what happened to Iran. To be honest, it's exactly the same thing as what was happening in Iran. But I just wanted to actually say something about the video that you showed with this particular lady. I do think it's there's 2 points that I wanted to make. First of all, I agree with you. She keeps talking about this is how wars are won. I mean, what war is she talking about? You went in overnight. You hit a couple of targets. Yeah, that's not a war, honey. I don't understand what it is that they're trying to project, but that's not a war. You went in, you illegally abducted the president. Okay, you shut down, electricity and internet for a short period of time in order to conduct a special operation.
Got out
that's
of
it.
the raid
that's not
happening.
A war. Yeah, exactly. That's not a war, but it's interesting how they're using special operations and sort of redefine it as a war, and how that's being repackaged in order to sell to the American public in order to show this supposed American military might when there's no military might there. This is not how a war is. But the second most important point that I wanted to mention, and I think this is a sort of a good little segue into other points that I'm going to bring in a little later on, is sort of the difference between the public persona that the CSIS, for example, is trying to put forward and what their reports are saying happening behind the scenes, because most people are probably going to have access and they're going to sit down, they're going to watch these little short, social videos that they put online and sort of give people the impression that the United States has conducted this major military operation that is to the envy of the other military powers around the world. But behind the scenes, the same, the CSIS in 5th of December, 2025, so basically very recently, published a report. And in that report, they were specifically talking about basic missile defense systems and missiles for defense systems. And in that, they had basically concluded that the United States, if it does not establish the kind of industrial base to start being able to produce at the numbers that they need to be able to sustain not just the international demand at the moment, because obviously, as we've said multiple times before in this program, you've got the EU that's been completely demilitarized and is now, they've had all these massive deals that they've made with the United States under the NATO umbrella. Supposedly they're going to be purchasing massive amounts of military stockpiles and infrastructure and missiles, supposedly to prepare themselves for war with Russia. There's already a backlog there where they can't even meet the demands of the European Union, who have bought, like I said before, bought all these supposed military munitions, missiles, etc. But also the United States can't even produce for itself. And actually, in that report published by the CSIS, of which she's actually currently speaking at in this video, it actually concludes that if the United States doesn't do anything, this is the report. If the United States doesn't actually meet those demands, it's going to, quote, have to sit out future conflicts. I mean, we're talking about the world's military power here, and what the CSIS report has concluded is that the United States might not even be able to engage militarily with other peer powers. And this follows a series of reports by the same think tank that has systematically said that the war would be won based on industrial base, and that the United States doesn't even have the capacity to last for more than several weeks in a war against a peer. And yet she's sitting there and trying to sell to the American public this illusion, and it's a dangerous illusion, that we are this indefensible military power, and this is how wars are won, about a special operation over a few hours in Caracas, in one of the poorest countries in Latin America and around the globe, because of the impacts of the U.S. Economic warfare on that country. And they're gloating about saying this is this is the exemplary of what the United States means, of its military prowess. But again, there's a huge difference between the public sort of the social media, I guess, friendly explanation, but what they're actually reporting behind the scenes. And it just goes to show how they're trying to manipulate the public, and that this is more so for show than it is the reality of the situation. And I will get into that in a little bit later, but I did want to highlight that point, because in my humble opinion, that special operation, everything that has happened since, and the way that the United States has actually sort of backtracked on a lot of its points with regards to Maduro, with regards to the Bolivarian state, and how now they're working with the Bolivarian state. And a lot of the, I think it was the New York Times has even come out with basically reports, insider information, including CIA basically reports that have concluded that the United States doesn't have the military capacity to enter in Venezuela and conduct a regime change. This just shows how and to what extent she's lying to the public. How to the degree that Hegseth, all of them, Marco Rubio, Trump, they're all trying to present something that is really not the truth.
Yeah. It's just not. And we also don't have the capacity to effectuate a regime change operation, because we can't dismantle all the loyal elements inside the Bolivarian government. Like, personally, do I suspect that there are factions? I mean, there are factions within the Venezuelan military. Part of them may have sold out Maduro, gave away the location as a human intelligence asset. We're not going to know. We're not going to know. We might know if Navy SEALs conducted the operation and not Delta Force, because then we'd have 7 books about it. But we're not going to get that yet. So, but it doesn't even look like regime change at this point. You know what? It looks more like this, and this is what people are talking about. This is the Panama model. And just to remind everybody, very short history. 1989, General Noriega, who was a paid CIA asset, huge anti-communist, helped the CIA fight against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, while he was, became an actual narco trafficker when he was in power in Panama. And of course, the U.S. didn't really have a problem with that. However, it was a different time. there's still the vestiges of the Soviet Union at the time, and we still were worried about soft power. And he was becoming an embarrassment because we needed Panama. He was expedient for the control of the Panama Canal, which was one of our greatest military and strategic assets in the Western Hemisphere. And he had to be taken out because he was becoming a liability. Completely different circumstance, but they sent in a small force. It was kind of overwhelming at the same time. I learned about Operation Just Cause, which I call Operation Just Because. Because I went through a process called Ranger indoctrination after I passed election, where you learned about Operation Just Cause because the Rangers seized all the airfields and destroyed a lot of the private aircraft and captured beach houses and stuff like that. And it was another more special ops porn. They're it really wasn't an invasion. It really wasn't a huge military action. And they basically used a lot of the same institutions that the government already had in the first place. So I don't think a regime change is going to happen the way they think it was. But what we have learned about this is when it comes to getting involved in Iraq, Afghanistan, is 40th order consequences down the line.
No, but you know what I would say? That I would actually argue, based on the information that I'm seeing come out, that they always knew that regime change was impossible. That the entire narrative of supporting the opposition it falls within the context of trying to delegitimize Maduro and present him as the dictator that nobody in Venezuela wants, and that he's only, the only way that the Bolivarian state and the Chavistas are still in power is fundamentally because of as a consequence of the state suppression. The Venezuelans themselves do not want them. Back in 2024, in July, I think it was in July of 2024 or August of 2024, we had the elections, and we saw this was not under Biden. Sorry, this was under Biden, not under Trump. And the United States at that point had argued that the electoral process was a scam, and we've repeatedly heard this over the last decade that there haven't been free and fair elections, and therefore they do not recognize Maduro. And in fact, in the latest elections, they argued that Gonzalez at the time had been the one to actually win the election, since Maria Corina Machado was banned from being able to actually run. So this has been the longstanding argument. They according to the evidence that was presented by the United States, or if you want to call it evidence, there's a lot of questions as to how legitimate that evidence was. The opposition had won by over 60%. By over 60%. We're talking about a huge majority here. Yet now, what we're actually seeing, and what the Trump administration is saying, and the New York Times article had also kind of disclosed that behind the scenes, for a lengthy period of time, it has been understood that Machado is not popular, that the opposition is not very popular and it's fractured. When we're talking about opposition, there's so many different types of different opposition inside of Venezuela. It's fractured, it's not popular, it won't be able to legitimately govern Venezuela without having military support. This was published today, or actually yesterday, by the New York Times, and this was based on a CIA assessment. And this has been the long-standing position of the intelligence apparatus, because going back to even a report from November and even August of this year, when we're discussing September rather of this year, not this year, 2025. I forgot with 2026, you guys. But yeah, of 2025. Yeah, I know, right? It hasn't hit me yet. But yeah, so even in September of 2025, the CNN report, according to multiple experts who had insider information, they had concluded the same thing. Even if you get rid of Maduro, there'll be another Maduro. There is a very entrenched sort of political, military, and apparatus inside of Venezuela that is far more than Maduro. This is a Venezuela, the Chavista movement is an ideological movement that does have popular support. Even if there are criticisms, there is still a very deeply entrenched ideology and political establishment that won't easily be defeated. And this was established. We had this conversation. There've been multiple reports on this from way before. This isn't new information. And so the understanding was that if you want to bring about Machado, bring to power the opposition, you need not just a military operation, but boots on the ground, which even according to these experts months ago now said that the United States would not be able to do. They do not have the recruitment, they do not have the military capability to be able to have a prolonged and protracted military presence. inside of Venezuela, because it won't be just about getting rid of the Maduro's government. You then have to fight the military, which are loyal. You got to fight the paramilitaries that are loyal, and there's millions of paramilitaries, 4.2 million paramilitaries that are ready to defend Venezuela, including the fact that they do have popular support. I mean, this is just the reality of the situation. And now what we're seeing in every report that's coming out, and the reason they've backtracked entirely is because now they're revealing the truth. And that being that Machado and the opposition are not popular. And I actually even want to say one last thing. In the New York Times, they're claiming that according to insiders, the establishment supposedly is frustrated with Machado for misrepresenting and misguiding the American intelligence that Maduro was weak and on the verge of collapse, because they came to find that wasn't the case, as if the American intelligence didn't know that, as if they were relying solely on Maria Corina Machado's information in order to be able to conclude to that point. That is clearly not this. That's clearly not the situation. But what they're doing now is throwing her under the bus. She's become like sort of she served her purpose, and her purpose was to demoralize and undermine Maduro at the international level. And once they've done that, now she's going to be disposed of. And what the United States is trying to do, having understood very well and very clearly that they don't have the military capacity, that the Venezuelan people will not tolerate regime change, that they can't enter Venezuela and defeat the Chavista movement. They're trying to blackmail the leadership, because this is what Trump basically said. Mm-hmm. If you do not, and they gave 3 criteria, and I think they were outlined. Rubio said there were 3 major demands that the U.S. wants, and if you do not, we can get into those demands a little bit, but if you do not abide by them, you will have a fate worse than Maduro. However, the reality is they can't do really a good deal very much. They're going to do probably short-term military bombardments for several weeks, but it's not going to do. They can't do anything more. And so right now it's all about, will Venezuela call the United States bluff, or will they capitulate? If I was Venezuela, if I was Rodriguez right now, I would call the United States bluff. This is what I would personally do, because it would have major it would actually completely expose the weakness of the United States if they do that. But we'll get into that in a little bit.
Yeah, no, she definitely has to walk a tightrope, and I think she can. Like, she is a political animal. You know, she started off as a communications minister, and now she's probably going to be the president. So definitely think she'll be able to like survive. It looks like she's kind of playing ball, at least in some ways, at least publicly, but behind the scenes, like, who really knows? I don't think like there's still like too much of an anti-imperial bent, even within opposition parties within Venezuela, which you're allowed to have. Crazy that a dictatorships has opposition parties, but I did want to discuss, like, you talking about how. Referencing how like the CIA said, or the State Department said, that MCM diluted our intelligence. First of all, you always kind of have to beware the promises of exiles. This is I think like that's kind of universally understood. And when it comes to like Venezuela and Iran, I think a lot of people need to get better at diaspora politics, specifically media literacy about what voices are being platformed, where they come from, what their backgrounds were, and what their relationship is to the current government. So this is kind of like a lot of, after the revolution in Cuba, a lot of people like Marco Rubio's family, they left a couple years before the revolution, went to South Miami, and they were all heavily conservative. A lot of them even supported Batista. Like most, they right-wing, authoritarian, fascist, dictator, like, totally cool, complicit, as long, totally down with U.S. military, political, diplomatic intervention, as long as they got to be rich and empowered. These are the voices that are propped up on this issue, and every other like left-wing voice is going to be silenced. There is not a lot of legacy media penetration into Venezuela. They do not platform professors or journalists in Venezuela. They don't. It's always exile diaspora folks. So when we see that most of the Iranian diaspora that are platformed, they're all monarchists. They want Shah, the clown prince, Reza Pahlavi, to like return and turn the whole thing around. those come from families who were they were the bourgeoisie of the Shah's government, which was roundly hated enough to actually have an organic popular revolution, that had like no trace of imperialism in it. So this is what's being platformed. And one thing I want to point out is that some voices are empowered and some voices are completely disenfranchised when it comes to, regimes like Venezuela and Iran. One exception, and I wanted to bring this up because it's very important, no Palestinian voices in the Palestinian diaspora are ever empowered or centered. Even though there are rich Palestinians, they're not going to be put up and talk about the Israeli occupation because that is our colony. That is our empire. We already control it. So why would they platform disenfranchised Palestinians to talk about human rights violations in the West Bank or in Gaza? It doesn't happen. And there's a reason why it doesn't happen. So when you see on imperial media voices being platformed, got to get better at diaspora politics and being like, what's going on here, guys? I just wanted to make that point. We're going to do a whole episode on diaspora politics on Monday with an Iranian American journalist, a Venezuelan American journalist, and I think an Indian American journalist, if we can get them all together on the same time. But look at that for Monday. That's all I wanted to mention about diaspora politics when it comes to serving these imperial ends. They're always pro-capital voices too, right-wing voices, conservative voices.
No, I 100% agree with you. They, in the case of Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, as well as many other examples around the world, a lot of these individuals tend to be tied to former aristocratic part. Like you said, they're part of the bourgeoisie. They were benefiting off of a corrupt system that benefited, obviously, a particular class over everybody else. And so they function purely from a position of, capital and self-interest. They are sponsoring imperialist narratives that served them, and they're therefore they don't need to be given the kind of legitimacy that many choose to. And I would also like to argue here, and we can obviously move on, expand from this topic, but it's also very important to understand that when we're assessing geopolitics as well as internal politics, we have to always look at the facts in question and not simply look at we need to give voice to certain particular we have to give voice just to Venezuelans, but just to a particular class of Venezuelans. No, that's just not how politics works. That's not how history works. We have to use an analysis, facts, and reason. And if you have the facts to back up your claims, that you can make those claims, that we need to have the tools those are the tools that are necessary to be able to engage in a sort of dialectical dialogue that will help us achieve the truth. It's the same thing. I'm not a U.S. citizen, but I discuss U.S. politics. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? This can be applied to anyone, everywhere, and I think it's very important because this has become a means by which to silence legitimate criticisms, I guess, of these so-called Venezuelan voices or Cuban voices in the diaspora. So basically, just sort of building this, arena by which, or rather keeping people out from having a critical thinking approach to imperialism and how they operate in these countries. And it doesn't serve us in any particular way, especially if we're trying to have an anti-imperialist conversation.
Yeah, and here's the thing, I hate saying this because I don't want to disenfranchise or delegitimize anyone's critique of a government or a political leader at all. That's absolutely not what I'm about at all.
No.
However, saying that, the big measure by which to make an analysis is lived experience is the most rad lib shit ever. You can't actually
100%.
solve this problem because Maduro's bad too, but so is U.S. intervention. Just listen to Venezuelans and see what lived experience is not a basis for an adult appraisal of anything. I'm not discrediting it. If I want to pretend to be a journalist, I have to at least listen to people's lived experience. It's just not how you evaluate U.S. imperialism. And that's what's in question here. I'm not telling Venezuelans how they should feel about it. We're talking about the imperial plan of the region. That's it.
Yeah, you have to contextualize a lived experience on its own without providing historical context or factual analysis of the economic realities and political realities of any given country, state, or particular state of affairs. It won't do anything. Lived experience on its own can be manipulated and drawn out in any way, shape, or form as you want. You have to always stick to logic and facts, and therefore kind of contextualize any sort of lived experience within those facts. And any person is able to therefore argue and debate on that. But I guess, that's that particular topic. But in the case, for example, of Maria Corina Machado, I just find it very interesting that the CIA and the intelligence apparatus in the United States, as well as obviously the state itself, is now trying to somehow pretend, because it's absolutely ridiculous, that all their information on Maduro and his popularity and how resilient the government came from Machado. This is absolutely nonsensical. I think it's important to understand that. I think the United States was very aware as to the popularity and how resilient the Chavista movement was in Venezuela, which is why they were using economic coercion for the better part of the last 2 decades in order to coerce the state to fall apart, and even that failed. So I think they're very well aware of the resiliency that exists within Venezuela, and this is particularly the reason why right now they conducted a special operation as opposed to an all-out war, and this is an intimidation tactic in order to try to threaten the remaining leaders in Venezuela and its people to surrender and capitulate on 3 key points. Do you want to get into like what the demands right now are from the United States?
Let's do it, because they're going to be pretty identical for other states. We're going to try to replicate this. It's completely unworkable, but let's go through the points.
Yeah, so the first one is, and I'm just going to bring up just in passing because this is just mostly for political spectacle, that is, you need to stop the inflow of drugs and cartels of drugs into the United States.
Wait, real quick, I don't want to interrupt you, but
yeah,
we probably should play the Stephen Miller video.
Yeah, okay, go. Let's do it. Yeah, let's go.
Because a lot of this is just such bluster. And guys, Stephen Miller is the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and Homeland Security Advisor. His mother didn't let him have his ice cream before dinner one time when he was a child. And that absolute trauma has shaped his entire personality. If you look at this, just a little boy who wants ice cream when he wants it, and he wants it now.
Is using its military to secure our interests unapologetically in our hemisphere. We're a superpower, and under President Trump, we are going to conduct ourselves as a superpower. It is absurd that we would allow a nation in our own backyard to become the supplier.
It is absurd that you cannot eat ice cream before dinner when you're 6 years old.
Of resources to our adversaries, but not to us. To hoard weapons from our adversaries. To be able to be positioned as an asset against the United States rather than on behalf of the United States.
Sovereign countries should be able to do what they want to do.
The Monroe Doctrine and the Trump Doctrine is all about securing the national interests of America. For years, we sent our soldiers to die in deserts in the Middle East to try to build them parliaments, to try to build them democracies, to try to give them more oil, to try to give them more resources. The future of the free
Yeah, we tried to give Iraq more oil, guys.
World, Jake.
You guys gave Iraq more oil. That's what happened. You guys are just going in, like, delivering oil into the Middle East.
America being able to assert ourselves and our interests without apology. This whole period that happened after World War II, where the West began apologizing and groveling and begging.
I don't even know.
Okay, well, first of all, I did mention this. Like, during the Cold War, we did care about soft power. So, like, we didn't want to look like the complete absolute monsters. This is gone. We're done. We're done with soft power politics.
Honestly, what you're talking about right now.
What I'm talking about, Jake, is the idea. And by the way, I know you love doing that smarmy thing, Jake, and I was hoping to be better than that this time.
I asked you about if there should be an election.
Exactly.
I asked you if there would be an election in Venezuela. That's what I asked. I said, why was the president so quick to dismiss Machado? You answered that question. And then I said,
the objective, Jake, is security and stability for the people of Venezuela.
Which means no elections. All right, so that was crazy.
I mean, it goes back to the point that I was making as well, right? Of course they're not going to have elections because they understand that there is a popularity steal that's going to back the Bolivarian state. But even now, I don't know if you saw, but there's even been reports that have come out whereby members of the opposition are even joining the pro-Maduro protest now. So what it's actually done is that even the individuals who have had and members of the opposition who have been critical of Maduro are so vehemently against the United States intervention and the kidnapping of their president, they view it as a direct violation of their sovereignty and basically, like it's a form of banditry in their country, that they are now backing the Bolivarian side. If anything, it's actually rather emboldened and rejuvenated the Chavista movement inside of Venezuela. I mean, if you're going to have elections right now, you really think that the opposition is going to win? The same opposition who was calling for U.S. invasion of Venezuela, Venezuelans are very well aware of it. I mean, even if the opposition had a modicum of respect by certain aspects of Venezuelan society, that has significantly diminished because of this. As in, the Venezuelans inside of Venezuela are very dissatisfied. Even members of the opposition, people who support the opposition, are very unhappy with the opposition in Venezuela right now. So that's why they're not going to have elections. They're not going to have elections because they're not going to get a different outcome. And this is why I referenced that New York Times article, and why, according to the CIA reports, they said that our best bet is to work with the Bolivarian state, because they understand that the Bolivarian state is still strong. It's deeply embedded in the political military level, but also at the social level. And the idea that they're going to have an opposition that's going to back and become like a puppet state for the United States is not plausible. That's why they're not going to have elections. This is why they're getting so defensive, because the narrative that they've been selling to the world for the better part of the last 20 years about the dictatorship of Chavez and the Bolivarian state and how it's unpopular and repressive, it has been proven now it doesn't stand. So they need to find an alternative way by which to achieve their goals. That's why they're not going to have elections. But I do find it funny that the CNN anchor also went on to say, but shouldn't a country have its own ability to decide its own future? And it's like, well, no, no, absolutely not. Not in our backyard. In our backyard, you do not have that right. But Ukraine has a right to decide if it wants to join NATO. And you see how they're contradicting themselves in so many ways. They're contradicting themselves in what's happening in Eastern Europe. They're contradicting themselves with what's happening within Venezuela itself. And it's getting to the point that they're discrediting themselves openly.
Yeah, Greenland's like,
and Greenland.
Yeah, apparently they're just going to want no health care. They're going to want absolutely no access to public services, just like we have in America. Sign me up. You know what? They want ICE shooting their citizens. So, yeah,
that's
they're
exactly
totally going to sign up.
Well, listen, let's get to the 3 points then that I was going to say. We can connect that to Greenland because it's pretty much the same thing. So the first point is, the first demand is stop the drug exports to the United States, or inflow rather of drugs into the United States. That's the first point. The second demand is very clearly to stop entering to trade deals and collaboration with countries that are deemed as adversaries, so to the United States. So they mentioned Cuba, Iran, obviously Russia, China, among many others. You are no longer allowed to engage in any sort of commerce or, trade relations or diplomatic relations with countries that are considered adversaries to the United States. And then the third demand is, do not sell oil to countries that are considered adversaries to the United States. That would obviously be particularly targeted to China, that relies on oil because it doesn't actually produce on its own. It relies on massive imports of oil from different sort of locations, whether it's Iran, whether it's Venezuela, and so forth. It's also one of the main reasons why Venezuela has been so geostrategically important for China, and why they've invested so many billions inside of Venezuela, and why they have one of the most prestigious statuses in terms of their diplomatic relations alongside, within Chinese politics. So the idea here is very clear. We can't defeat the Bolivarian state. We can't actually establish regime change. So what do? We intimidate, and we make sure that it's a gamble, basically. It's a gamble by the United States at the moment because it's of its sheer desperation, in order to force the Venezuelan state to cut its ties off essentially with China, to cut its ties off with Russia, and to expel, also take out the BRI project from ever materializing inside of Latin America as a whole, but also cutting off Russia and its own military access and collaboration with countries that are obviously right next door to the United States, that they view as an existential threat, which the United States hasn't felt since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, having Venezuela work alongside and establishing all these military alliances with Russia is a very direct threat to its own sense of military security, which is ironic given what's happening in Ukraine and the Russian argument, which has the long-standing Russian argument that has been obviously, we do not want NATO on our borders, and we do not want especially NATO controlling the Black Sea, which is one of our main access and water ports to international trade, and also our military infrastructure. Now the United States is sort of feeling somewhat threatened, and the threat itself is far more marginal than what Russia's feeling for its part. But That's a different story. The point is that they want to cut off. This is a war on multipolarity. This is, again, part of their greater war against China. But most important, to sustain control, because by controlling resources, you're going to be able to weaponize that against China that relies on oil. You're also able to weaponize and fluctuate prices. That's going to affect Iran and Russia, who rely on resource exporting in order to sustain their economies. And simultaneously, this is the most important aspect, the fact that Venezuela and China were developing new trade deals, and we were seeing the exchange of oil in their own currencies, yuan being the main choice of currency used, just as much as it is between Russia and China at the moment. The major fear that the United States has is de-dollarization, and how that's going to manifest if you have oil and gas giants that are now trading in currencies that are no longer the dollar, and what that means in their ability to control global finance, trade, and essentially there has been, the financial institutions that has been the main means by which the U.S. has been able to sustain their hegemony. So this is what the U.S. is trying to achieve right now in Venezuela, and this is why they're so desperate. The direct hit is China. That's the main goal when they're talking about why should they be selling oil to our adversaries. That's what Mr. Miller was discussing.
And, this is actually kind of interesting, because the Venezuela thing's not going to work out the way they want to. They're going to have to find a way to spin it, like how this was like an uncompromising U.S. victory here for both the country and the people of Venezuela. It's going to be such a harder sell for Cuba, because they don't have massive natural resources. They're not as connected to our geopolitical rivals like China or Russia. And, Trump is not, I don't think Rubio is going to be able to activate, the entire defense apparatus to orient towards that, or the White House to orient towards doing something even substantial to Cuba. I think he's basically trying to appease this Miami power base, Cuban American power base, which is very influential within the administration and Florida politics in general, that they're going to actually move on it. But like what? How? Like, how is this practicable?
I mean, to be honest with you, I think Cuba's probably the least of their worries. I guess I'm most concerned in terms of, does Cuba want to in any way become a base itself for foreign adversaries? I mean, that could be it's about restricting the access to Cuba for in future for adversaries. This is what it is. Right now, the United States is on a path to, I guess, secure future resources, but also potential military assets for their adversaries. So by taking control over these resources and key territories that could be used potentially in the future. It's about securing the Western Hemisphere for themselves, because they're feeling the threat, they're feeling the heat. This is where Cuba comes into it. But right now, it's not the primary concern. The primary concern is Venezuela, because of what Venezuela means. I mean, it's the greatest oil exporter. We've said this before. It's right next door to the United States. It will allow the United States to exploit cheap oil, which will be great for the data centers that they want to set up in their tech race that they are at, the tech race that they have with China at the moment. It's going to be central to de-dollarization if Venezuela continues to grow alongside Iran, and into this new sort of parallel financialized institutions that China is establishing on its side in order to sidetrack and bypass the sanctions warfare and the United States dominated financial, networks, what that means for the U.S. empire. So Venezuela is it's a huge, it's not just a splinter. It could actually, be the means by which to paralyze in many ways, U.S. power. So, and if they don't do it now, it's what I've said before. If you allow Venezuela to continue as it was on the path and the trajectory that it was on, without at least trying to get them to capitulate to your needs, Venezuela would become all the more economically self-sufficient. It would fall completely outside the scope of Western control. And as BRICS are establishing all these other alternative, financial avenues by which to bypass sanctions, that means that Venezuela will be able to have a growing economy and a more prosperous future, and that American sanctions and economic warfare will basically no longer work. That's why they're resulting even now to just this is gunboat diplomacy at its finest. I mean, they're kidnapping presidents and holding the current administration at gunpoint, saying, if you don't do what we say, I mean, this is Even The Godfather is more sophisticated than this. I'm thinking back to like these mafia movies. This is exactly what it is. And so it's
it's worse than you think.
It is.
It's not worse than you think. When you brought up The Godfather, I just have to read for the audience the most gangster text ever that was just put out by Donald Trump. I am pleased to announce that the interim authorities in Venezuela will be turning over between 30 and 50 million barrels of high-quality sanctioned oil to the United States of America. The oil will be sold at its market price, and that money will be controlled by me as President of the United States of America to ensure it is used to the benefit the people of Venezuela and the United States on the day of my daughter's wedding. I have asked Energy Secretary Chris Wright to execute this plan immediately. It will be taken by storage ships and brought directly to unloading docks in the United States. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
But this is so. I want to discuss this because I hadn't yet had an opportunity to discuss this. But the whole, the fact that allegedly Venezuela has accepted to give them 30 to 50 million barrels of oil, and obviously this has caused a lot of fear in people. Does this mean that Venezuela has capitulated? Not really. I mean, the United States has been stealing Venezuelan oil now.
Chevron's always had a carve out to work with Venezuela. Yeah. Like this is exactly crazy. This is not really changing anything.
No, this is what I wanted to draw. Like the United States, like you said, Chevron has still continued to work inside of Venezuela. This is well within the range, to be honest with you, that they would already be sort of taking the American companies already would be taking anyway in terms of like how much oil they're taking. And just for context, Venezuela produces around 330 million barrels of oil per year, if not more. And this particular percentage point, this is about a month's worth of production. It really is. At 30 million, it's about a month or about 2 months worth of production that the United States has taken. And frankly, they have been appropriating Venezuelan oil now in their tankers for the better part of the last 3 months. This is just theft. This is just classic theft. And to what degree Venezuela had accepted it, or whether it was, it's part of the United States appropriating this oil. That's a different story. But the point is, this doesn't mean that the Venezuelan state has capitulated. This is nothing different as to what's already been occurring in Venezuela. If Venezuela is to capitulate, is to accept to cut ties with Russia, China, Iran, basically kick out Russian military forces and support that currently exists in Venezuela, and basically end all trade ties with China. That will be when I can say that the Venezuelan state has capitulated. As of right now, that's not the case. I don't think it should be the case. I think that the ball's in Venezuela's court, and they need to call the United States bluff, because as I've said earlier on, there's absolutely nothing that the United States could do to actually get Venezuela to capitulate to its wants and needs. And this is then a desperate act in this particular moment in time of the United States to try and take control over these vital resources, and to control its hemisphere in order to cut out its adversaries. And this is the same chain of reasoning is the reason as to why the United States is also claiming that they want Greenland for themselves. But I don't know if you're ready to move on to Greenland just yet, but I am.
May as well. I got 10 minutes left before I have to go do another thing, but let's try to get into Greenland, because JD Vance is saying some stuff. Marco Rubio was just questioned earlier. I think I do have a clip, because it's about a journalist asked him how that will affect the relationship with NATO. That's interesting.
Statement last night saying that the military option.
You've lost weight. He's lost a lot of weight.
Thank you.
So he preempts the journalist's question by saying, he lost a lot of weight, and Pete Hegseth thinks that's funny.
They said the military option is on the table. So is the administration really willing to risk the NATO alliance by potentially moving ahead with military operation?
What I think the White House said yesterday is what I will tell you.
This is a military operation against Greenland.
Now, and I've always said, the president always retained the option. Every president, not this president, every president always retains the option. I'm not talking about Greenland. I'm just talking about globally. If the president identifies a threat to the national security of the United States, every president retains the option to address it through military means. As a diplomat, which is what I am now, and what we work on, we always prefer to settle it in different ways. That included in Venezuela. We tried repeatedly to reach an outcome here that did not involve having to go in and grab an indicted drug trafficker. Those were unsuccessful, unfortunately.
Okay, first of all, before I get your take on Greenland, Vietnam and the Star Wars thing really, really thematically binding what we're talking here, because right now this smacks of madman theory. And if you guys don't know, it came out of the Vietnam War. It's a foreign policy strategy where a leader appears irrational, unpredictable, and volatile to gain leverage in negotiations by making adversaries believe they might use extreme or crazy actions, like escalating to nuclear war, in order to force concessions. It's kind of like adjacent in some ways to gunboat diplomacy. It was actually popularized by tricky Dick Richard Nixon, who used veiled threats during the Vietnam War. It suggests perceived madness makes if he seems like irrational, kind of makes non-credible threats credible, though like modern analysis like really questions its effectiveness and suggests it backfires generally. And I think that's what's happening right now. Like this is not going to work out.
Well, so this is the interesting part. I mean, okay, so first of all, what are the reasons that the United States actually even wants Greenland? Obviously, they want to have access to the North Arctic Sea trade route that right now is being dominated by Russia. This is the reality of the situation, given that it's an Arctic country. It's been dominated by Russia, and Russia has been industrially preparing itself and also has excelled. It has a speciality in the Arctic, in order the ice breaking, etc. And obviously, Russia and China are allies, and China was actually the first to set off and use the North Arctic Sea trade route back, I think it was in October. And it actually had gone from, all the way to Europe, I think, Northern Europe. I can't remember exactly the trade route, but China has been the only country to successfully actually use the North Arctic trade route with the support of Russia to actually begin trading in the North in the North Arctic Sea. Now, if you look at the map, I don't know if you have a map available of the trade routes, it actually almost halves the amount of time that you would need to trade vital goods, basically in commerce, through the North Arctic Sea, as opposed to going through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. Right? So what does that mean? It means that you're cutting shipping time, costs, which means an increase in profits, and it means that control over global trade and economy that now falls firmly within the sphere of influence of Russia and China, of which the United States itself has fallen very far behind. Now, the United States has multiple issues here. Firstly, the United States hasn't been investing in icebreakers since pretty much the 1970s. The last time it manufactured an icebreaker was in 1976. It basically has barely any fleet, and it doesn't even have the expertise or the capacity to even mass produce. I think in the last few weeks, I've seen articles that have said that they're trying to work or buy sort of icebreakers from Finland, or they're going to produce alongside Finland, bringing them, I think 2 icebreakers overall, but that's still pales in comparison to basically Russia's kind of commanding power in the North Arctic Sea. So Greenland, which obviously is currently part of Denmark, is a very strategic location for the United States to be able to kind of take control over this vital new trade route that's being established, that's going to be even more financially and economically has more financial and economic potential than even that of the Suez Canal area and the Red Sea, or the Gulf of Aden, which, we're already seeing what's happening in the region there with the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Israel and the United States trying to dominate that particular region. And we discussed in the previous episode, although, very marginally, Somaliland, and why they're recognizing Somaliland and why they're trying to establish bases there. And that's all about controlling, this vital trade route. And this is the same thing. Just like the trade routes around by the Suez Canal, the Gulf of Aden, it's integral. It was one of the central nervous systems of global trade and therefore global capitalism. This is going to basically rival that in a very dramatic way. So if you're able to control the North Sea route, you're able to basically control and influence global economy, and also even finance, for that matter, and how how you're choosing to engage in exchange in terms of financial exchange, in terms of the commerce that's going to be crossing through this trade route. So this is very important, and at the moment, the United States has fallen far behind. It's fallen very far behind, and they're trying to catch up again, and they're desperately acting out with regards to Greenland.
I mean, they're pretty much acting out too, because they just seized a Russian flagged oil tanker right here, right off the coast of Iceland. So yeah, we've entered a new age of impunity, and they're just going to try to take it now. What is workable diplomatically and militarily remains to be seen. Because, like, this isn't, like, it's Greenland. It's like one of the most inoffensive countries ever.
And the EU is not going to do anything. The EU is not going to do anything, because let me be very clear about that as well. The EU right now is firmly within the control of the United States, given the fact that it relies solely on the United States. Well, not solely, but for the most part, for its own oil and resource necessities in order to keep their own economies going, given that they've cut off, obviously, energy imports from Russia. So, and also because of that, the unequal exchange is sort of taking place, gives the United States huge economic leverage over the EU, as well as obviously the military aspects and the impending supposed war with Russia, and the fact that the EU is severely demilitarized. I mean, the general issue that the EU has is that it's economically and so militarily weak, that is so dependent on the United States, that I don't really think they're going to say no to the United States. So they're going to find some sort of diplomatic solution by which to give the United States access and rights to Greenland. Maybe not, they're not going to give the totality of Greenland to the United States, but they're going to have to capitulate on certain key points. But they've put themselves in that situation by becoming so economically and politically and militarily weak.
I mean, what we can expect is at least like commercial maritime rights at certain ports, key ports, stuff like that. The building of warehouses, things, maybe a military base. I would assume military base and military assets. And they can do it under the guise of NATO too. Like this is like a NATO operation, but it's basically just strong armed by the United States. Look, NATO's not going to do anything. Marco Rubio was just asked by the journalist, like, because of the ongoing Djangoism and completely demilitarization of Europe, like, NATO leaders and NATO command needs the U.S. So I don't know. They have no leverage in it, and it doesn't even need to be gunboat diplomacy, because they can just come in and do it, because they're our vassals at this point.
They've become a complete, vassal. Yeah. They've all become vassal states at this particular point. So there's nothing that they're really going to do. What are they going to declare war against the United States when they don't even have a military? Really? I mean, Are they
going to sanction the U.S.?
What are they exactly? They're not going to do a damn thing, and they've put themselves in this particular situation because had they decided to cooperate with Eurasia, of which they're a part of, and which would have been more economically prosperous for the people of the EU, for the working class in the EU, in terms of the opportunities that would have arisen, they instead chose to wage war against Russia, to wage war against China as well, in many ways, economic warfare, because they're abiding by the United States demands when it comes to, obviously, economic trade and relations with China as well.
Israel to the hilt. That hasn't been great for them.
Exactly. So the economic vulnerabilities that they've imposed on themselves, which didn't have to be the case, means that they're at a particular stage where what the United States says they will have to do, unless they completely change foreign policy, which I don't see happening. But that's just the reality of the situation. But again, this all goes back to war, the broader war against China, and the battle to sustain hegemony, American hegemony over vital resources, financial infrastructure, that then they are able to exploit in order to combat and weaken, so they think, their adversaries. But I think, and I'll just finish it off here because I know you're rushing, I think if anything, what this proves, I think what's happening in Greenland and Venezuela is the desperation of the United States, the fact that they're trying to catch up on races and that they've fallen far behind on. They deindustrialize. They don't have the capacity to be able to mass produce to keep up with their military, warfare abroad. They're stretching themselves very thin, to the point that even by their own CIA intelligence report, they can't even handle a war with a poor country like Venezuela. Not more or less a bigger conflicts with Iran, Russia, and China, and that same industrial sort of limitation is also the reason why they're losing. They won't have access, and they won't be able to influence the North Sea trade routes as they desire to, because the deindustrialization that took place in the United States meant that they were not producing and geared towards doing so. So again, it's a race to catch up, but that won't happen. And we're seeing that desperation manifest itself in these special operations
Delta Force propaganda, baby. And
exactly.
I think ending here on China as the great adversary is a good way to round it off. So let's just hear from Victor Gao, the Beijing-based, who is the vice president for the Beijing-based Center for China and Globalization. I think a lot of our audience will be familiar with him. Just talking about, the disparity and power disparity between, these resource manufacturers. We have oil. We wanted to kind of control it with regards to China. That's one of the obsessions with Iran and Russia as well. But they have all the rare earths, and they have the capabilities to process them, which we don't.
Make one point. If the United States cannot get rare earth products from China to the United States, the U.S. national defense industry need to grind to a halt. Many countries claim they have rare earth. Ukraine say they have rare earth. Russia said they have rare earth. Myanmar in Southeast Asia said they have rare earth. California says they have rare earth. They may have rare earth, but how do you extract them? How do you refine them? I would say it will take minimum 25 years for the United States to reach the level of real commercial production of rare earth. Even if it starts today, plowing in hundreds of billions of US dollars in doing that, the real thing is not to talk about decoupling China from the United States. The real arrangement to complement each other, using your superiority to support me, and I will use my superiority to support you, rather than viewing China-US relations as a zero-sum game.
Wouldn't that be nice coming from us? All this, again, circling back, it's bluster. It's not going to work. And in the meantime, you can expect more violence at home and abroad. Rest in peace to the woman who was killed by ICE officers earlier. So what the hell?
Yeah. It was unfortunate. That's why I feel like I was a little bit disoriented at the beginning, because it was such a shock when you told me what happened. I hadn't seen it. But yeah, the sad part is it's the beginning of a lot more violence in the U.S.
Yeah, it's going to get a lot worse too. And a lot of people are going to be confused by why their life sucks so much. And they're going to fall into these narratives, these government narratives. So there we go. Anyways, I didn't want to. Did we have anything hopeful to say beyond it's just not going to work? It's going to get worse before it gets worse, but this will collapse.
Well, it's not, I think that is rather hopeful, because when the weakening of the United States, if the Venezuela, it's what I try to say in some of my posts that I wrote on Instagram earlier on, actually rather yesterday, the more that the United States continues to overstretch itself, if Venezuela basically calls out the United States bluff, knowing that the United States doesn't have the military capacity to be able to intervene in Venezuela and carry out a long protracted war of occupation, then eventual regime change, and then completely basically changing the military apparatus, the social sort of ideology within Venezuela, that's impossible. You can't bomb the socialist, anti-imperialist ideology out of Venezuelans. It's just impossible. You're probably going to embolden it. If Venezuelans keep to their guns and they don't surrender, this will expose the United States, its political weakness, its military weakness, and it will embolden national, or rather not even national, liberation movements and struggles around the world. And it will weaken imperialism to the degree that it will allow for these movements to begin to prosper, but not just internationally, but even inside the US as well as within the EU. It's an opportunity to bring about true sort of, I guess, change by organizing and mobilizing, because, the impending future, it's going to be somewhat brutal. However, it's the unraveling of an imperial power. And so it is a time of opportunity. And I guess that's the positive note that I would like to leave it on.
Yeah. And everybody's waking up, just this shooting was really egregious. So get to work on your people in your own personal sphere, and force them to engage with this and make them talk about it. And, you may be that friend who's annoyingly political. Well, that's because you're the one doing all the work. So what they need to start doing is taking up 10% of that burden and reading one article a week. I don't know, whatever you got to do to get people engaged. But this was absolutely crazy. So big announcement coming next week. Stand by for that. Colonial Outcast going forward into 2026. We'll do an episode Monday Wednesday, and we'll have a Patreon thing every Friday. So if you go into Patreon, that's what you'll see. And yeah, we're gonna leave it there, and we're gonna see you next week to talk about diaspora politics from people in the diaspora. All right, cheers, y'all, and we'll see you next time.